Hi church, it's great to be with you. We're going to have 5 minutes on the Apostle Paul. I'm going to quote a lot of the things that Paul says about himself from the book of Acts and from some of his letters. We won't have time to mention where they come from, but if you're interested, contact me and I'll point you in the right direction. First of all, Paul, his background. He says that he was a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, which was a citizen of a very important city. And really importantly, he was a Roman citizen from birth. Trust me, that meant he was one of the real privileged of that time. Not only that, he says he was circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, one of the elite, and punctilious on all points of the law. He kept the law. He not only was that, but he was a Pharisee. And the Pharisees were really important at the time of Jesus and becoming even more so. In fact, the Judaism we find today is really born out of the Pharisee movement. Now, Jesus was critical of the way they did things at the time. There was only about 6,000 of them in the country at the time of the birth of Jesus, but they may well have increased rapidly in number. The Pharisees were mad keen on keeping everything to do with the law. And they praised a guy in the Old Testament called Phineas. Phineas at the time of Moses found somebody having sex with somebody who wasn't of the children of Israel. He goes into a tent, gets a spear, sticks it through both of them, and he's praised as doing something to preserve the honor of God. Wow. So he becomes a role model for a lot of these Pharisees. And they use the idea of violence as being justified because it's being protective or zealous for God. Now, it's really important to get that in your mind, because here's Paul, keeps the law, and it says he's zealous for the law, and he's become a Pharisee. So what happens? He becomes a persecutor of the church. It's justified in his mind to kill Christians because they're deviating away from the law. He's one of the tough guys. He's one of the guys sent out to kill and to imprison Christians wherever he finds them. He says that he was brought up in Jerusalem. So although he's from Tarsus, he was brought up in Jerusalem. He was educated strictly in the ancestral law at the feet of Gamaliel, Rabbi Gamaliel, who was probably one of the most well-known scholars of the day. His family seems to have that zealot connection, because later when he becomes a Christian, he becomes a target for 40 assassins who are given the job of killing him. And he has to run to the Roman garrison to protect himself from being killed. All of that lies in the future. He's persecuting the Christians. He's binding them up to the point of death, both men and women. So this is Paul. What do we know about him? Well, we can work out roughly his age. To do what he did, to sit at the feet of Gamaliel, he had to go through the strict education process. By the age of 5, he'd have been reading the scriptures. By 10, he would have had them memorized by heart. At the age of 10, he would have started the oral studies of the Mishnah. He would, by 13, have had to keep every commandment without fail. By 15, he would have to be fluent in the reading and study of the Talmud. He would be fluent in Hebrew and in Aramaic and in Greek. And not only that, he was skilled and trained to be a leather worker or a tent maker. Tent maker sounds a little bit more low class. It's not. It's a privileged, high-valued skill and trade that he has. He supports himself all through his journeys. He doesn't draw money from the churches. This skill that he had was common for the rabbis. A lot of rabbis who were very, very serious rabbis also had a trade. So we can see he's been shaped and formed. At 16, he was sent to study under Gamaliel, and he'd have been with him for 4 years. So he'd have been 20-year-old when his studies were finished. Now then, this becomes, I think, quite interesting, because we find that Paul does not meet Jesus prior to the events on the Damascus Road. So Jesus started his ministry in 28 AD. We can more or less be certain that Paul finished at 20-year-old his studies under the rabbi. Now, when we next meet him, he is doing this important job for the Sanhedrin. He's killing Christians. Not being funny, you don't give that to a novice. So, I don't know, maybe he was on a mission for the Sanhedrin out of Jerusalem while Jesus was there. But he later gets that job. Paul you're the guy that's going to have to go and kill the Christians. And he chases them and hunts them down wherever they are. He's on his way to Damascus when the big event happens. Now, just as regard to his name is Saul, but the Greek version of the name is Paul. He doesn't change his name, and God doesn't change it. It doesn't say that anywhere, although I've heard preachers claim it in the past. Paul is used when he's in Europe. Saul is used when he's in Jerusalem. Stephen, the deacon in the church, was killed probably 32, 33 AD. And we know nothing really of Paul's life until that point. But when we come to this moment, we can imagine that Paul is very likely to be a man in his early 20s. And he's standing there while Stephen is stoned to death. Stephen was one of the deacons of the church. He was appointed when the church was expanding rapidly and they needed people to look after the distribution of food to the widows. Stephen gets the job. Stephen starts preaching because he's not just an administrator, he's a preacher as well. And he gets stoned to death. When he gets stoned to death, the person standing casting judgment upon him is Paul. All the people lay their cloaks at his feet. They acknowledge him as having the judicial right, and then they go and kill Stephen. So that's how we introduce to Paul. He then goes on this Damascus road, and on this Damascus road we find he gets converted. He sees this incredible bright light. He goes blind initially. He hears the voice of Jesus speaking to him. Now, that story is quite well known, and I'm sure we can look at that later. He spends the next 3 years hiding in Arabia, trying to figure out. Maybe the Sanhedrin was after him. The Christians certainly don't trust him. And probably he would have been in Petra, the capital of Arabia. 3 years later, as I say, he returns to Damascus and he starts to preach Jesus. And at that point, he nearly gets killed. He has to be lowered down the city in a basket to escape. He starts going to Tarsus and preaching in the surrounding area. Eventually, a guy called Barnabas comes along, asks him to help and teach in Antioch. And together they start to see Gentiles being converted in great numbers. And eventually Paul visits Jerusalem with a famine relief offering. And when he goes there, he talks to Peter and to James, the leader of the churches, and he starts to make the case for the Gentiles. He then goes out on a journey called the First Missionary Journey to gather money for the Christians caught up in the famine. He returns to Jerusalem at a highly significant moment. This is when they have a conference that determines what they expect Gentiles to do. There's a huge pressure for every Gentile to be circumcised and to live by the law. Paul says, no, Gentiles aren't bound by that. And he develops that idea and the church accepts it. The impact on ourselves and our salvation is forged through that decision at that conference in Jerusalem. And we are born again by grace, the free love of God. And when we come to Christ, we're governed by the law of the heart. Love God with all your heart and soul and mind. Love your neighbour as yourself. But we do not have to live by the law. Very quickly, he goes on 2 more missionary journeys. They are highly successful. Eventually, he comes back to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, there's a confusion. He has somebody with him in the temple. The Jews think he's brought a Gentile into the temple. And literally everything erupts. And at that point, the assassins are sent to kill him. He has to appeal to the emperor to stay in jail to protect himself. And eventually finds himself in Rome. The book of Acts comes to an end around 64 AD. Paul may well have been released at that point. And from the letters of Timothy and Titus, it may be that he actually got to Spain that he always wanted to do to preach. But by the later part of 64, 65, he returns to Rome and he's martyred. Very quickly, there's one description of Paul that I love. It's from a guy writing 100 years later from records. But the guy's a bit of he's kicked out the church for his beliefs. But he claims Paul was bald-headed, bow-legged, short, with a big nose, with an unbroken eyebrow that lay across his forehead and looked like a dead caterpillar. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But Paul actually does say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person, he's unimpressive. We do know that he has something that's an illness or something that causes him great trouble. God doesn't heal him, but he reveals to him that he's made strong in his weakness. Just to finish, I'm going to quote a couple of things from Paul. These are the things that Paul went through. He says, 5 times the Jews gave me 39 lashes with a whip. 3 times the Romans beat me with a big stick. Once the enemies stoned me. I've been shipwrecked 3 times. I've even had to spend a night and a day in the sea. During many travels, I've been in danger from rivers and robbers and own people and foreigners. My life's been in danger in the cities and in the deserts and sea, and with people who only pretended to be the Lord's followers. But he also says these words, hold them, because he's been through all of that, had the most amazing life, trouble like we will never see. But he says this to the Roman church. I'm sure that nothing can separate us from God's love, not life or death, no angels or spirits, no present, nor the future, no powers above or powers below. Nothing in all of creation can separate us from God's love for us in Christ Jesus our Lord. Forgive me, I've gone over my 5 minutes, but it's a tough call. Thank you, and God bless you.